Hafide, buenas todos hamzo. Guahosi Robert Underwood. I'm with the Pacific Center for Island Security. In the past year, we in Guam and the surrounding island region has been the subject of many plans involving great power competition between the United States and China. As U.S. citizens and as islanders, these plans directly impact all of us. This month, Secretary of Defense Austin is in Papua New Guinea. Secretary of State Blinken is in Tonga, and Interior Secretary Hallen just came through Guam last week and attended the inauguration of FSM President Semina in Pohnpei. Next month, we in Guam are being asked to review the possibility of 20 sites related to an enhanced integrated anti-missile defense system on our island, which will literally rearrange our lives, take new land, and be part of a structure most of us do not fully comprehend. It behooves us to understand the technical dynamics of an anti-missile defense and its requirements. It is important that we understand the history of anti-missile defense systems, and it is critical that we yet take another look at Guam's role in this, not as pawns or as a community to be informed, but as knowledgeable partners. Much more than in the past, we must be knowledgeable about defense planning, geopolitical trends, missile and anti-missile technology. You know, the first missile age began with rocket technology coming out of V-2 rockets in Germany, which were launched against Great Britain in World War II. The Cold War following that and the dawn of the nuclear age brought with the exploration of space new changes to rocket technology that ushered in the ICBMs, so-called missiles of doom. The escalation of nuclear-capable ICBMs and the era of mutually assured destruction sort of ensured a rational approach that kept limits on continuing escalation. We had arms control treaties, and we had the anti-ballistic, the ABM treaty, and the MAD doctrine kind of kept a loose lid on nuclear proliferation. So that anti-missile treaty between the U.S. and the USSR was to reduce the need to build more new offensive weapons to overcome any defense that the other side developed. So this was a substantial, had substantial impact and factor in curbing the strategic armed force, the strategic offensive arms. So the end of the Cold War brought with us now a world in which the U.S. dominated, and the rise of regional powers in Asia began to erode the treaties that had been previously in place. The weakening and ultimate end of the ABM treaties, the end of treaties on tactical IRBMs, regional missiles, and a general rise of new powers seeking new weapons capability has spawned this new kind of missile age that we find ourselves in. And if you throw in the competition and the rise of China in this part of the world, that provides the new thinking about what Guam's role is and what Micronesia's role is. So the U.S. pulled out of the ABM treaty in 2002. The U.S. pulled out of the IRBM treaty with Russia in 2018, claiming that Russia was violating it. Of course, the North Koreans and Chinese were never part of these regimes. So here we are at what we call the forward edge of the new missile age. So with us this morning, and this in Guam, and this afternoon on the east coast of the United States, we have two panelists that will help us kind of understand the dynamics of some of this. We have Dr. Laura Grego, who's the Senior Scientist and Research Director of the Global Security Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she has been focused on how public policy interacts with science in nuclear weapons, missile defense, and space security issues. She is a subject matter expert who is frequently consulted by national media and interacts regularly with federal agencies and international organizations, as well as continuing to be an academic leader in her field. She holds a PhD in experimental physics from Caltech and BS degrees in physics and astronomy from the University of Michigan. We also have with us Mr. Matt Korda, who is an associate researcher with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and more importantly is the senior research fellow for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. That's FAS, not the Micronesian FAS, Freely Associated States. He co-authors the Nuclear Notebook, the authoritative open source estimate of global nuclear forces and trends. He has worked on arms control and disarmament and WMD Non-Proliferation Center at NATO headquarters in Brussels. He's co-director of the Foreign Policy Generation, a group of young people working to develop a progressive foreign policy for the next generation. He holds an MA in International Peace and Security from King's College London and a BA in European Studies from Victoria College at the University of Toronto. We are fortunate this morning to have acknowledged experts in missile threats, particularly as they are emerging in our part of the world, and anti-missile systems as they are being planned around the world. So the issues for conversation this morning are related to our situation here in Guam. Why is Guam a target, and what is the capabilities of the PRC and North Korea? What are, quote, defensive missiles, and what are offensive missiles? And what does it mean to have the end of mutually assured destruction and this kind of new situation that we find ourselves? When the Soviet Union was the principal threat to the United States, Guam was no more or no less threatened than the rest of the US in an all-out nuclear conflict. In this current scenario of US-China, where both sides seem kind of ready for a regional conflict, Guam is actually more threatened than any other place under the US flag. So we have many issues to attend to, and we're grateful that you have joined us this morning. And so I'll first go to Matt Korda. Good afternoon, Matt.
Good afternoon, or I guess good morning for you guys. Thank you so much for having me here. I have some slides that I've prepared, so I just want to make sure that you're able to see these. And how's that looking, Dr. Underwood?
Looks good.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you so much to the Pacific Center for Island Security, to Leland, to Ken, to Dr. Underwood, to Laura for joining us here today. And thank you very much to folks who have tuned in. We're really looking forward to the discussion on these very critical issues, as Dr. Underwood mentioned. So, my name is Matt Korda. As Dr. Underwood mentioned, I'm a senior research fellow for the Federation of American Scientists. And the goal of our work at FAS is to try and pull back the curtain on excessive nuclear secrecy and to empower the public with factual information about nuclear weapons policy and operations and trends in order to challenge assumptions, challenge the things that we are often seeing in the headlines, and to improve accountability amongst our policymakers. And so we use open sources to try and understand as best we can what is going on in the world of nuclear weapons. And because missile defense is such a big part of that discussion, we look at missile defense quite a bit. And so given that we track the arsenals of all of these different countries and states, I've been asked to tie together some threads that were mentioned in the introduction and to consider some of the trends that we're seeing in the missile development space. And there is, I think, more than enough hype out there surrounding things like hypersonic glide vehicles and other things like that we see in the headlines all the time. And so I hope to cut through some of that today with an honest assessment of the trends that we're seeing here. And so perhaps, I guess, the most important trend that I want to emphasize here is that we're increasingly seeing this pretty dramatic blurring of these categories that we have previously used to describe different types of missiles, right? So during the Cold War, we have traditionally drawn distinctions between ballistic and cruise missiles, which are generally distinguished by their trajectories, right? Ballistic missiles are guided during the initial stages of flight, and then it travels unguided to their target in a ballistic trajectory. Cruise missiles are generally powered throughout the majority of their flight times, and they don't necessarily follow those trajectories. But today, it is relatively rare to find a modern ballistic missile, especially from a country that has a pretty sophisticated ballistic missile program, such as China, and in many ways also like North Korea, that could be considered purely ballistic. And instead, what we're seeing is that most modern missiles are capable of some form of guided or maneuverable flight after the end of their first phase of flight finishes. And that can be accomplished through a whole variety of different types of systems that can be included inside of different missiles, right? We have these different modules and kick motors and post-boost vehicles and hypersonic glide vehicles and all these other types of systems. But what they all amount to is that they allow modern missiles to effectively alter their trajectories in pretty substantial ways, right? Ranging from conducting just simple corrective trajectory adjustments to conducting pretty sustained, perhaps hypersonic flight on these very maneuverable trajectories. And so what that means is that modern ballistic missiles are not purely ballistic anymore. And that has implications for the ways that we talk about missiles, but it also, it has ways for the policy implications as we try and think about limiting the spread of missiles and how countries can engage with each other on things like arms control. And so, for example, we can dive into some missiles that have direct implications for Guam security, right? So China, has several missiles, including some of these that you can see on your screen, the DF-21D and a particular variant of a missile called the DF-26. These fly on traditional ballistic trajectories throughout the majority of their flight paths, but then they also have maneuverable reentry vehicles that can potentially allow them to change their flight paths at the very ends of their flight. It can enable them to perhaps strike ships at sea. It could potentially be used to evade interception. And this has implications for the ways in which we talk about missile defense too. China has also been making strides in hypersonic flight, right? And I think it's worth just kind of stopping for a minute to break down what that phrase actually means, because there's a lot of hype out there around what hypersonics actually mean, right? So when you hear the word hypersonic, you think about these incredibly fast speeds, but that isn't necessarily what we're talking about, right? Ballistic missiles, in many ways, can travel much, much faster than these new kind of boost glide vehicles. The difference is that the boost glide vehicles that are commonly referred to as these hypersonic missiles travel within the atmosphere at a very maneuverable on a very maneuverable flight path at very high speeds. And in theory, this makes them much harder to intercept. So the hype around hypersonic missiles that we hear is a lot more about their maneuverability rather than just their speed. All right, so these are the kinds of things that we're seeing programs being developed in China, in North Korea. And it's important to think about these as we think about how missiles are changing and what these implications are for Guam's security. And so, you can sort of see, this is just a really quick breakdown, but you can see that, through this survey that was done a few years ago by some researchers at the Aerospace Corporation, they took a look at nearly 80 missiles that, are operational in countries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, things that we would traditionally call ballistic missiles. But they found that only about 1/3 of them could actually be called ballistic, right? The other 2/3 of those had all of these different components on them that allowed them to have these maneuverable trajectories. And the maneuverability is what really has implications here for the missile defense that we're seeing being deployed in Guam, right? Because these are things that are meant to be able to hit some of these missiles. And if they're highly maneuverable, that might not necessarily be the case, right? So what is driving these recent advancements in modern missile technology? I would suggest that there are about 3 main intersecting factors that are at play here, right? So the first is that the technology itself is advancing very rapidly, right? So in particular, there are several long-standing technological barriers that scientists had been seeking for many years to conduct this kind of maneuverable flight at hypersonic speeds. Those barriers are slowly being eroded, right? So we're seeing that new materials are popping up in different types of missiles that are allowing them to make these kind of maneuverable trajectories and fly very quickly on those trajectories. Second, I think there's an element of prestige that's typically associated with the development of a lot of these missile technologies, right? About 10 different countries, including 7 out of the 9 nuclear-armed states, are known to have hypersonic technology demonstrator programs of some form. And the media and political hype around those types of missiles is probably contributing to the arms race in some way, because politicians, in many ways are continuously advocating for those developments in their new systems simply to just match the capabilities of other countries without necessarily considering the roles that those missiles would be asked to play in their own military posture. And so for some countries, it appears that we're sort of seeing this situation where the weapons are being developed first, and then the questions of how and when to use them are being answered second. And then third, I think it's also increasingly difficult to ignore that missile defense systems are playing a role in triggering corresponding reactions in countries that are seeking to modernize their offensive missile technologies. And so the combination of things like hypersonic speeds, low altitude flight profiles, and maneuverable trajectories make modern missiles increasingly adept at evading even the most advanced missile defenses. And that is what they are in many ways specifically designed to do. So, a good example of this, in 2018, right, President Putin unveiled this kind of new suite of what many in the media called these exotic missile systems. And they included all of these different types of systems, that seemed kind of wacky in the media, right? They had a nuclear-powered cruise missile. There was this nuclear torpedo that was meant to cause a tsunami, right? There was this heavy ICBM. There was a hypersonic glide vehicle, right? But all of these things, what they all have in common is that they are all specifically designed to circumvent missile defenses. And this was something that Putin himself said many times during his speech, right? And so it's really important to recognize this sort of action-reaction dynamic that we typically see when countries do something to potentially increase their own security. But the cost of that is that then other countries will take their own measures that try and circumvent those initial moves. And we see this in China as well, right? Like last summer, our organization was one of a few different organizations that helped disclose that China is constructing approximately 350 missile silos in several different complexes across northern China. And although China has deployed missiles in silos before, it's never done so on this kind of scale. And there are a lot of factors that are probably influencing that decision, but it's likely that one of those factors is China's desire to circumvent U.S. missile defenses and to offset U.S. advantages in conventional precision strike capabilities. And so these are the kinds of things that we're seeing when it comes to other countries taking steps to improve their own security in light of what they perceive to be an increase in U.S. defenses or in U.S. Conventional capabilities. And so not only are we seeing that when it comes to nuclear systems, but these types of countermeasures are also increasingly being incorporated onto conventional missiles as well. And this is something that we're seeing right now on the Ukrainian battlefield, right? So last year, images of this new type of kind of mystery munition were posted on Twitter. They came straight from the battlefields of Ukraine. And what the US intelligence subsequently concluded was that these munitions were decoys that were deployed as part of a Russian missile system. And what happens is that when these missiles are, mid-flight, it kind of pops out these little decoys that are specifically designed to spoof the missile defenses, right, and air defense systems of Ukraine. And so, this is incredibly interesting, right, when it comes to thinking about these dynamics, because this isn't just happening in the nuclear space anymore. It's also happening in the conventional space. And so, what this kind of tells us is that no matter how much missile defenses improve, they're always going to face really significant challenges when it comes to countering modern missiles, because we're seeing these types of countermeasures all the time, right? And the prospect of developing a missile defense system that is able to reliably defeat highly maneuverable missiles at high speeds is pretty questionable. So, it's unlikely that these kinds of offensive technological developments could be countered by investing in corresponding defensive technological developments. And so, I think at this stage, I will leave it there and we can get to the discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that report, especially trying to understand the so-called Guam killer, the DF-26 missile, which is regularly pointed out here locally in Guam as a reason for a more sophisticated and robust anti-missile defense system. We now go to Dr. Laura Grego. Laura, you can tell us about how do you defend against missiles?
Thank you so much for inviting me, Dr. Underwood and Leland and Ken and TBS Guam. And thanks for all of those who are tuning in so early to talk about a topic like this. As Dr. Underwood mentioned, I'd spent a lot of my career looking at strategic missile defenses, which I'm going to mention because they're a little bit different than the problem that we're talking about today. So defense of the continental U.S. homeland from long-range nuclear-armed ICBMs, which are very, very fast. And the requirements on a system are extremely high because they're armed with nuclear weapons. And you're defending an enormous amount of territory. So the topic we're talking about today is different in significant ways. Guam is a much smaller place, very, very much smaller place. Overwhelmingly, I think the problem will be conventionally armed missiles. So while the stakes are high, they're not as high necessarily. And they're shorter range missiles, so they will be slower than ICBMs. So I'm going to step through some of the systems that the Missile Defense Agency, the Pentagon has developed to address some of these shorter range type missiles, which have been talked about as some of the types of systems that may be put together in the new Guam Defense Plan. So the first that you should know about, of course, is the Patriot system. These have been around quite a while. They are designed to defend U.S. deployed forces and critical assets from short-range ballistic missiles and medium-range threats. They were originally designed to defend against aircraft, but at the outset of the 1991 Gulf War, it was rushed to the Gulf to try to defend the Israeli population and U.S. military forces against attacks by Iraq's al-Hussein ballistic missiles, which are a variant of the Scud, which had a range of about 600 kilometers. It turned out in that case, the Patriot system almost completely failed to succeed. An investigation by the House Committee on Government Operations found that there's little evidence to show that Patriot hit more than a few Scud missiles entirely. It is a mobile air system and missile defense system, and it includes a mix of the previous PAC-2 missile defense interceptors, which are blast fragmentation warhead interceptors, meaning the missile defense tracks an incoming missile. The interceptor comes nearby and it has a blast fragmentation, and it just tries to destroy the incoming missile with basically bits of shrapnel. That's the old system. There's a new system called PAC-3, which is designed to be hit to kill, which is much more sophisticated technologically. And instead of a blast fragmentation, it does have a blast fragmentation to assist, but it's meant to run into the threat with the force of impact to destroy it. More recently, the United States supplied Patriot PAC-3 systems to Saudi Arabia to help it defend against missiles launched by the Yemeni Houthi forces. In 2017, the Houthis attacked the airport in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, using a variant of the Scud with a reported range of about 1,000 kilometers. According to evidence collected during and after the attack, it looked like the defense fired 5 interceptors at the missile, but that warhead flew unimpeded over the interceptors and detonated at the airport. So it was not successful. I should also mention in this sort of category of the short-range missile defense systems, because it's also been mentioned in the same context of Guam, the interceptors of the Israel's Iron Dome system. That's also designed to destroy the warheads of missiles traveling within the atmosphere. So both of these are meant to destroy things that are short-range that never leave the atmosphere. So they can't necessarily be fooled by the types of decoys and countermeasures that we'll see on these longer range missiles, and some of which I think Matt showed in his pictures. The Iron Dome system also has a blast fragmentation warhead that explodes near the target missile. The next relevant system to talk about is the THAAD system. So the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. That's what that stands for. That system is designed to defend U.S. deployed forces and allies from short-range ballistic missiles, medium and intermediate range threats. So a little bit longer than the Patriot is. So it can defend a bigger piece of territory against longer-range threats. And those are using guided interceptors, both in endo, meaning within the atmosphere, and exo, which means above the atmosphere. And the reason that's important because exo-atmospheric, up above the atmosphere, there are more countermeasures that are simpler and lighter weight that can be used to confuse the defense. So THAAD has a battery. It is developed and fielded by the Army. It is also a transportable system with a bank of interceptors and a very high-powered X-band radar, which can see quite a distance. And as adversary missiles will come, these interceptors will try to meet them just above the atmosphere or just below where the atmosphere starts. So it has a sort of a defensive area of around a couple of 100 kilometers forward, in looking forward. It can't defend behind itself. Those are really designed to defend areas about the size of military bases against, again, short to intermediate range missiles. And so it can attempt to intercept around between 40 and 150 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And the third, really the most relevant system that we would talk about is the Aegis system. And that's one that's fielded by the Navy. It's normally on ships, although there's a variant called Aegis Ashore. But that was originally designed to basically defend carrier groups from short, medium, intermediate range ballistic missile threats. So there's both the sea and land-based variants of this. And it has, so these ships carry what they call basically launch tubes that can carry lots of different things. And those might include missile defense interceptors. They might include offensive missiles. They also include missiles that are designed to maneuver in the atmosphere to catch things that are within the atmosphere maneuvering, like cruise missiles, or maneuvering, sometime in the future, maneuvering glide vehicle. So it's meant to also be capable of anti-air warfare, terminal ballistic missile defense, and to defend its own self, anti-ship strikes. So these ships are meant to defend themselves and defend their neighboring ships. So those have also been called in to defend land areas. They're hosted on Navy cruisers and destroyers. There's also variants which are called Aegis Ashore ground sites. There's one in Romania, there's one in Poland, and there's a test site in Hawaii. Each of these systems includes a 4-phased S-band phased array SPY-1 radar. So the S-band is a little less powerful than the X-band radar that comes with the THAAD. And so in dozens of these vertical launch tubes that I mentioned, so they can launch the SM-3 hit-to-kill interceptors, and these shorter range ones. Of course, it has a hit-to-kill system. I've mentioned the radars because they're actually really critical and really important. I'm sure that's something that you've been hearing in the news as well. To have any sort of attempt at intercepting a missile, you'll have to see it in time to know where it's headed, have a good idea of where it's headed, and with enough precision that you might be able to guide your interceptor close enough to either have a blast fragmentation or to run into it. So you'll need powerful radars. And most of these systems you're meant to not just have the radars, but the radars are meant to be able to talk to each other. You might have a first line of them to make the initial detection and pass that information down. So it becomes a very complex command and control program in order to understand where the missiles are, where your interceptors are, where it's headed, what you might choose to target such a thing. So these are all existing systems, although of course they haven't been ever put together in a specific way to defend a place like Guam, although there are analogies, of course, to carrier groups. So how do we know how well these systems work? Most of them have been around quite a while. So we have some good senses of what they can do and what they cannot do. And of course, something that's going to is really important is what Matt mentioned, is that the testing system has to be able to be tested against a realistic version of the threat. One needs to understand what might be incoming in order to really have an idea of how useful your system is. So the systems that exist have had a pretty good set of testing on sort of most of your, everyday type threats. They've already been developed to the point where most of the reliability is pretty good. But where the testing program really still needs to have work done in order to have a sense of what they can do is a set of realistic threats, which continue to evolve. Also, I think so. The testing authority in the Pentagon is called the Office of the Director of Operational Test and Evaluation. The operational in that title means having a system that's out in the conditions that one might expect for it to actually be used, as opposed to the testing that you do when you're building something and trying to make decisions about how, what the parameters are or what you're going to build it like. But once it's built, how does this work in the real world? That's where the rubber hits the road. So in the Pentagon, there's an actual authority who is independent from the rest of the agencies, meant to be independent from those who are building the system, who are advocating for the system, and they're meant to be the checks and balances on, is the system good? What can it do? What can it realistically do? So that's, of course, the place where you always want to keep an eye on these systems. Where are the testing programs currently, and what are their plans to test them in the future? So you have a real sense of what these systems can do. So when you take a look at where those systems are, again, I think we run into this issue that it's hard to test them enough. It's hard to know exactly what your adversary might be fielding. So you do need enough information so that you have a sense of the reliability of your system and what its use might be to you. So that's, of course, a place where you really need to keep a close eye on. So these systems are meant really, again, for defense of small areas, military bases, carrier groups against conventional threats. So there are, of course, not unlimited numbers of interceptors. These are all, and when I say interceptors, you should think of a small rocket with a kill vehicle on it. They're not unlimited. So of course, they can be overwhelmed in numbers. They can be avoided by having something that maneuvers around them. And they can be attacked directly by something that is designed to target those missile defenses themselves. So there are really three ways that you are going to worry about your missile defenses not helping you. You can overwhelm them, you can avoid them, and you can directly attack them. And so I'm going to stop here. That's sort of the basics of what you need to know to kind of think through these things. And I'm happy to talk in more detail in the questions.
Well, thank you very much, Laura, and thank you very much, Matt. That was a very comprehensive view, and it's, I've remarked that people of Guam and people in the region have to become scientists in order to be able to deal with these issues, which are policy issues, which are kind of wrapped up in emotion about what's going on in our environment. And it really is very helpful to understand what a missile defense system can do and what it can't do. And it's also helpful to understand what happens when you get a better missile defense, and in Matt's terms, you kind of trigger more sophisticated missiles coming your way, and the decoys and the maneuverability and all of that fits together. So, you know, in our case in Guam, and I'm glad you mentioned, Laura, about the radar sites, which are really key to this emerging system that is planned for this part of the world, because 2 radar sets are being planned for Palau, and ostensibly I'm sure there are others in the works as well. So trying to understand how these anti-missile defense systems work between THAAD, the Army, Aegis, and the Navy, and ashore, and kind of tribulations that Patriot missile batteries have gone through is really important for us to understand, so that we're not just trying to comprehend what the threat may be, but also what the actual response is capable of dealing with that threat. So the head of the Missile Defense Agency has said that the threat to Guam could be a complex and integrated attack of everything from drones to cruise missiles to ballistic to gliders, all kinds of things. So what would it take to defend against this kind of attack on Guam, and how would we measure that? How would we measure that we're actually ready for something like that?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, that's you.
That's
because
a really, it's a really
you know, you mentioned something inside the Pentagon, which I thought was very interesting. You said that there's a unit that is designed to sort of test the reliability of these systems, which is independent. I think of it as sort of like the devil's advocate, you know, like, sure, you're going to do this, but this is so what would it take to be the to actually defend against all this?
Well, so I would take a step back from that, and I think you can, as described, you know, if one were to say, you know, what you described is an enormous laundry list of everything that could possibly be done, right? So it creates a very formidable challenge for any kind of defensive system. And I would be, of course, alarmed hearing that list of things that you try to defend against. So I would say it would be very hard to do something like that. So my feeling is that there would be a set of prioritization of what's the most worrying threat. For example, you know, swarms of small drones are a different type of thing than a ballistic missile that can carry a large payload, for example. If maneuvering vehicles, some of them are still aspirational, some of them don't exist yet. Some of them you may not need to worry at the moment, but there are lots of types of things you can field. Almost all of these types of things, though, do need a different type of system. So my guess is the idea will be to try to field systems that could do more than one thing. But when you set the task of 360-degree defense, which is, so when I'm going to contrast that with the defense of the U.S., continental U.S., which is looking for ballistic missiles which come really from a very narrow corridor of trajectories. They don't come from any direction. They come up over the North Pole. You pretty much know where they're going. They don't maneuver a lot. And you have one direction you really need to look. While missiles can come from the other direction from submarines, the U.S. is not defended against that type of thing. So we just set that aside because we haven't decided not to do it. Or these types of things that Matt mentioned, exotic systems that can come around the other direction of the globe and attack from the south. The United States doesn't try to defend itself from missiles like that. The Continental, it doesn't. That's not part of the plan. We don't try to do that. It's a simple threat from North Korea. So setting this challenge sounds extraordinary. 360 degrees, and I've put everything into this basket that I can think of that might come your way. It sounds like one would really want to sift through that and say, what's really the priority? What's necessary? What do we think is realistic? What do we think is prudent? What do we think is achievable? And I do think there's a history of, especially for something like missile defense, it's almost always, you can almost always ask for anything because defense almost always sounds good. So I would say, I'm not providing a lot of information here. I would say I would look really carefully what those plans are and what they are meant to achieve. Are these systems mature? Are these threats really what we need to worry about? And then sort of be judicious about how those resources are expended, especially if you're worried about where are we going to put all of this equipment? Do we think it's necessary? Are we drawing, additional concerns by building those systems?
So Matt, you mentioned about the maneuverability of these, and the decoy development and all these kinds of things which are designed to confound and perhaps go ahead of proposed missile defense systems, which in turn then encourage actually more sophisticated missile development, in your phrase, trigger, and then what is going on in this process, and are there historical examples like this, in addition to kind of anticipating that the maneuverability of these missiles presents a really daunting challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. Certainly this is the arms racing world that we live in, right? This is, you have situations where countries, I guess it's what folks in the kind of academic community would call the security dilemma, right? Or perhaps in some cases, the security trilemma, right? We're dealing with multiple different countries here, lots of different stakeholders. But, you have situations where countries perceive a vulnerability. And because, particularly the United States does not like being vulnerable, right? As a country, I think there's really this kind of national ethos here of not wanting to feel vulnerable. But in many ways, vulnerability can be at the core of strategic stability, or at the core of, this kind of mutually assured destruction that did for many years in some ways underpin the security dynamic, right? So in this attempt to make yourself less vulnerable to a particular threat, you take steps to perhaps decrease a different country's security. And then that has all these ripple effects down the line, right? So, the example that Laura gave, when the United States withdrew from the ABM treaty right after the 9/11, right? This was an incredibly politicized moment, right? And at the time, right, there were conversations with Russian officials and Chinese officials who said, don't do this, right? You won't see it. You won't see what the response will be tomorrow, but maybe in 10 years, you'll see what our response is, because we will be forced to build, our way around these things if you decide to deploy them. It's what we ended up seeing. I think there are a lot of different reasons why countries go about building the things that they do. And, it's not always a reaction to another country, but certainly there's a powerful drive there, right? Of seeing what a country is building defensively and then wanting to sort of get around that in some way.
So for us in Guam, when we hear about enhance and integration and this integrated system, and then we think about the kind of developmental nature of this. It's not really a mature system. And then we hear some, military people say there's going to be a war with China over Taiwan within 1 or 2 years. It creates this environment which is very difficult to understand, because it also makes some of us feel like we're just being kind of the petri dish for this enhanced missile development. Because Laura, you said that there's no, this is not, this kind of anti-missile system is not, doesn't exist for the continental U.S., but here it's being contemplated here. And I just have I get the sense that we're kind of like, you know, guinea pigs, or we're kind of like the experimental design. Is that an unfair criticism, or is that you know, what do you think?
No, that's not an unfair criticism. I think when you listen to the conversation around this, it sounds like there are people who find it very exciting to try to build a system of this complexity, because make no mistake, it would be enormously complex. It's because of the way it's been defined, as you mentioned, it's this laundry list of threats coming from all directions, which makes it sound, and none of these systems are designed to work together. They're designed for different purposes entirely. So you don't, you know, the THAAD is a land-based system. Aegis is a ship-based system. Patriot is meant to be, you know, moved around. They're, you know, THAAD is meant to be air transportable, but not necessarily carted around. So the idea of making things mobile, as I said, having to be able to engage on remote or launch on remote, meaning this system has to take information from that system in order to do its job. There's going to be some complex command and control system that's looking and understanding what's coming and saying, there's a philosophy I've heard, not specifically with respect to Guam, but with other parts of the Missile Defense Agency, that it's any shooter, any threat. So that you have this sort of masterful command and control that's looking at this thing with great accuracy. And these types of, if something like this happened, if attack like this happened, these are not long distances. These are not lots of lead time that you have time to sit and contemplate what your choices are, what you're going to do, because these distances aren't so far that you would have more than minutes. So something that's probably likely to be automated. I think that's almost certainly part of this. And so none of these things really exist. So I think your sense of being a lab for experiments probably is not far off. It's I'm just, somebody's excited about this intellectual work, trying to figure this out.
Yeah, so
or the money that can be made from it.
Yeah, obviously there are many vested interests in this idea, and so the rationale for this, of course, is the competitive nature of the geopolitical competition between U.S. and China in this part of the world, which I perfectly understand that exists. But in order to support this system, it's not the competition that is being used to kind of generate support for this system on island. It's the nature of the so-called missile threat. You know, when I have these conversations, Matt, people say, well, that missile can hit us in 8 minutes. And so, you know, of course, if the DF-26 can hit us in 8 minutes, and now you've brought in the whole issue of are there decoys, and then there's also maneuverability, it changes the dynamics, and people sort of need to understand that. The level of concern is ginned up by such things as the Stratcom reports. Strategic Command says that China has now more launchers than the United States. And so in the whole kind of nuclear weapon world and missile world, can you contextualize for us what that actually means?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, you were very careful in your wording here, which I appreciate, because there have been many lawmakers and policymakers who have been significantly less careful in describing what the letter says and what the letter doesn't say, right? The letter that Strategic Command put out that generated so many headlines says that China now, in its estimation, has more ICBM launchers than the United States has launchers. It doesn't say more warheads. It doesn't say more ICBMs. But we saw immediately after that letter was published, a number of congressmen, specifically those, many folks who are working with the House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, claiming that China is effectively approaching nuclear parity with the United States and extrapolating this letter to kind of move into that territory. That is not accurate, and it is not what is not the claim that Strategic Command made. And something that's really important to note here is that even if, right, China does end up with more ICBMs than the United States, which it is possible, right? We don't really know what the shape of this buildup is. But even if that were to happen, that doesn't take into account the entire nuclear posture that the United States has. It doesn't take into account other legs of the triad. It is comparing a one-for-one system, right? Which is not really the way that I think folks in the Pentagon understand, nuclear targeting and nuclear policy. And so, even if China were to increase its number of ICBMs beyond the United States, it would still, its nuclear arsenal would still be significantly below that of the US. And something that's really important to note here, I think, is that, there's this study that I really love that the Pentagon put out jointly with the Director of National Intelligence in 2012. So the study is 10 years old, but everything it said it rings true exactly the same today. And it was specifically talking about Russia, but in this case, it works perfectly well for China as well. And what it says is that, Russia at the time would not be able to achieve a military advantage by any plausible expansion of its strategic nuclear forces, even in a cheating scenario or a breakout scenario under, the treaty that did previously exist, specifically because of the survivability of US submarines, right? And this exactly the same dynamic 10 years later. It works with Russia, it works with China. And so there are real questions when you contrast that sort of rhetoric that we heard, in that study 10 years ago, with the rhetoric that we're hearing today about, is China increasing its forces? Absolutely, right? Like that dynamic, as you point out, is happening. But is it dramatically changing the deterrence dynamic between the US and China? That I am much less sure about. So I think that I hope that helps put the letter in a little bit more context.
I think so. And so just going back to the issue of anti-missile defense systems, Laura, you and two other researchers in 2016 wrote the disastrous U.S. approach to strategic missile defense. Now, that was a few years ago, so I'm wondering, what did you mean by that then, and is that still sort of applicable today?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. The report was called Shielded from Oversight. We published it in 2016, and it was looking at the U.S. ground-based mid-course defense system, which is the only system designed to defend the homeland, meaning the 50 states, in this case, with apologies, from ICBMs launched by emerging missile states like North Korea or Iran. So this system was so of course, strategic missile defense, which is the defense against nuclear-armed ICBMs, has a long history, very political, very technical. It didn't start with the Star Wars announcement in 1983 by Reagan, but it was really kicked into high gear then. It came back down to earth and ended up being this type of system. And there were a lot of arguments in the late 1990s about whether the system was in our interest, whether it was technically ready. But with the election of George W. Bush and his administration was very interested in getting out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty that had been held for 30 years, keeping this offense-defense dynamic at bay. And decided to deploy a missile defense system using the technology that existed. So not exactly picking up parts from the shop floor, but similar in that they used what existed. And to do that, they had to loosen up these normal procurement rules. And I don't want your eyes to gloss over when I talk about military procurement. It isn't like the most compelling topic, but it's really important because there are rules there, colloquially called fly before you buy, where you have to make sure something works before you buy it, before you spend your money on it, before taxpayers put a dime towards it. You're supposed to really make sure it works. Because this was deemed so important and something that needed to happen so quickly because North Korea had tested a space launch vehicle, the system was kicked into high gear and rushed into the field with little testing and little oversight and a lot of money. And what ended up happening is that it didn't work. It didn't work very well. The testing program was atrocious. The test record was really bad. And it was a lot of quality control failures, design failures that could have been caught with like a really rigorous actual program that had good oversight and made you go through these step-by-step processes, which had been developed over decades, knowing that we don't build complex things without a lot of oversight. And they were just like, you're holding us back. We can't be, this is too important to do quickly. Well, you rush to failure. And I am a little concerned when I see the timelines that are being talked about for a system on Guam that has some of the same echoes to me, that you have to rush to something. It's so important. You have to do it fast. And what usually happens when you do something fast is you don't do it well. You skip steps and you don't have accountability. So you may have something, it's not even, the worst part isn't wasting money. It's having false knowledge or assuming something works better than it does, and your false reassurance. So that's something I'm always wary of when I hear about rushing in big complex systems.
Very good. Those are excellent comments, and I thank both of you for those, for this excellent conversation. The issue for us is obviously when we talk about homeland defense, one, whether Guam is included in that definition of homeland, and we're always a little bit uncertain about that. And so there's that issue as well. But this, the rush to judgment is really, in a way, a rush to failure. So in this conversation, I'm hoping that we're able to, provide ourselves with a little bit more information about the viability of this proposed enhanced integrated air missile defense system for Guam, and whether it actually works, and then how does it actually comport with the actual threats that we are supposed to be dealing with, which is a separate issue. And even if we were dealing with a threat of conflict with China over Taiwan or just in general competition, is investing billions and billions of dollars on a missile defense system on Guam actually going to resolve those conflicts? And that again is an open question. And I feel like we should have this conversation in Guam because Guam is being put out as the vehicle through which this ostensible conflict with China is going to be resolved, when in reality the system is not yet complete. So very happy for this conversation, and hopefully we'll have more robust conversations in the future. It is important to note that for the people of Guam, this means not only the increased military presence, but disruption in our lives. As you pointed out, Laura, some of these batteries may be mobile, so they have to be moved around. There are 20 ostensible sites on Guam. for the operation of this integrated system that covers the whole island in a way that has never been covered before. We're not sure of the land requirements. We're not even sure of the basic details of the systems, although the site selection, obviously, somebody has a real comprehensive plan, otherwise they wouldn't pick these sites, yet we don't really know the rationale for them. So very grateful for your presence today, Laura and Matt. Thank you so much. On behalf of the Pacific Center for Island Security, which is a new organization, nonprofit. I'm sort of in charge of it, and I'm working closely with Leland Bettis and Dr. Ken Cooper of the University of Guam, and we're trying to bring different ideas and a different perspective to many of the issues that we have to contend with in Guam. These are very serious matters. We have shifted in some ways in the conversation from being the tip of the spear, the basis upon which the United States projects power into Asia. Now we're sort of like the first strike community. In case of war, we're going to get it first. And then the military is trying to figure out how we're going to survive that and therefore respond in kind. It's not a comfortable place to be, but it's a place that Guam has been in before. And so we look forward to more robust conversations. Si todos hamzo, por favor, hasusti sa makadistisya na idea, makadi maplanenya para islata, and as always, we should stay in touch, and until we see each other again, goodbye. Adios. Go ahead, Polly. I can.
Okay, great. Pauly Suba with PBS. Thank you so much for this conversation, Matt, Laura, Dr. Underwood. My question is, at a press briefing on President Biden's fiscal 2024 missile defense budget that happened like earlier in March, the director of Missile Defense Agency, John Hill, he had said there's efforts to develop a new interceptor and modify the existing Aegis weapon system to defeat hypersonic threats in the glide phase. In your conversation, you were talking about how it's highly unlikely that they can defend against that. There's a request for hypersonic defense, $209 million in their fiscal year 24 efforts, and that will focus on early risk reduction of critical technologies. And so, like Dr. Underwood was saying, and then also just getting the pulse here in Guam, there is a great amount of people that feel that it is necessary to build a missile defense system in Guam, and they've already come up with 20 candidate sites to put these projects in Guam. Dr. Underwood said it at a town hall meeting, though, that we don't even know exactly what will be on these sites. Can you talk about, on what was detailed in that budget hearing? I'm not sure if you heard it, but I'm pretty sure that information is already out there.
Is that for you, Dr. Underwood?
No, you can go ahead.
You probably have a better idea than I do.
Well,
please go ahead.
We don't know what was in. Of course, I'm assuming that there may be government of Guam elected officials who know a little bit more than what's released in the public, including Congressman Moylan and Governor Leon Guerrero. And we're certainly hopeful that those items, those matters are shared. But I think the best way to answer that for Matt and Laura is that, is it typical to have these kinds of systems shrouded in an aura of secrecy, especially when it comes to how it's actually taking up space and land and rearranging lives?
Right, and maybe Matt or Laura can talk about, because you had said it's highly unlikely that they would be able to intercept some of this technology, but they're saying on their end, the director of Missile Defense Agency, that they are funding the technology to intercept.
So two pieces. The first piece is what essentially I think you're getting to, Polly, is whether we think it's technologically possible to intercept maneuvering glide vehicles. So, the answer to that, of course, depends. We don't do that now. The systems that we've built mainly are for ballistic missiles, which are predictable in flight. And the radars, the sensors, everything's built to defend against that type of threat. So those aren't well matched. And one of the problems, of course, is the radars are looking up, because that's where the ballistic missiles will come in, and they fly under the radar. Well, that's just because the radars are built for a different purpose. So it isn't something that makes it that you couldn't build them in a different way. So I think, though, and most of the solution to that has been you need to be looking more down, so from a height. The harder part of that, though, is getting an interceptor that maneuvers fast enough that you can catch up with a maneuvering vehicle, and figuring out how you do that. And that's a big engineering challenge. On par with the engineering challenge of building those systems in the first place, which is not simple. They get rapidly harder the more distant they need to go, because to go more distant, you need to be faster. The faster you are, the bigger heat you generate, and the more complex the materials and communications everything is. So it does depend on a whole bunch of engineering questions. So I'm not prepared to say that it's impossible. It's just that it hasn't been done, and is a complex system that's kind of starting from the beginning. So there are interceptor systems which are built to intercept within the. I should preface this by saying, to maneuver, you're going to be in the atmosphere. You're not going to be above it, because you need the atmosphere to push against in order to maneuver. That's the whole thing of these maneuvering vehicles. So we have interceptors that are designed to counteract cruise missiles, which are, moving through the atmosphere in some range of speeds. So we have some technologies, some sensors that work like that. So I don't think it's technologically impossible, though we don't do. Ballistic missiles are hard enough, so none of them. You really have to think about how good things have to be. Then the other piece of the question about what might be in those, and is it normal to not say what's going to be in there? I think no. I think an environmental impact statement needs to tell you, to properly account, you need to be able to say what's in it. A radar is different from an interceptor, is different from a command and control. The footprint, the energy, the environmental impacts, those should be transparent. My guess is the Missile Defense Agency is up against having this limited amount of space for all of the things it wants to do. The offensive and the defensive are going to get jammed into some small little areas. And I feel like they're bursting at the seams, trying to find other places to put these things. And as Dr. Underwood mentioned, there's this impetus for mobile things, which would be a really different model in terms of environmental impact, in terms of safety, security, all of those things. What roads can handle these things? How are you going to hide them? What's the policy? What's the strategy? What's the tactic? Those, I think, my guess is that hasn't been set out yet. But I think if you've chosen those sites, it's either because that's where we can fit in these new things around our existing offensive stuff, or we have a plan. And I think it would do to push a little harder on that, to see. I would say that information should be provided to the citizens of the island, so that they can properly weigh in on them.
I just have one more question, and maybe Matt could answer this, because you're talking about some of the technologies, right? Missiles in general. looking at the budget on missile defense and the ramp up, especially here in Guam, I didn't really see much, and maybe it is out there on cleanup, missile cleanup and whatnot, or even like shelters and whatnot. Is there technology in place now or funding to provide, especially like a community here in Guam after a missile attack?
That's a great question. My sense is like the civil defense part of things would be located in sort of a different bucket of funding than kind of your normal missile defense aspects, because those tend to be quite different. But I'm not, just in thinking off the top of my head, I'm not aware of any specific line item for that.
Right. Yeah, and that I think a lot of people here in Guam are saddened or frustrated to hear that there's this missile defense budget to defend against missiles, but there's no talk of what happens after if this were to happen, because the threats are real. They're saying they're real, and that's why they want to build up this missile defense. But what about after the fact? Just like after a storm, we just had a typhoon. There is a plan in place for recovery, and the community here in Guam, a good amount of people in Guam are worried that there is no plan after an attack.
Yeah, I can imagine that's very nerve-wracking, especially since, I'm sure that folks were probably watching very closely what happened in Hawaii, right? Just a few years ago, and seeing what the just the psychological impact of that, having on the population, which I can't even imagine, right? So, certainly, civil defense, I guess in terms of the broader issue of nuclear deterrence, has always been a somewhat controversial issue in some ways, right? Because it's another one of these ways in which you can sort of build yourself out of vulnerability. That being said, there are some instances in which doing these kinds of things to protect your population is incredibly important. And so I'd be interested to kind of dig more into that aspect on Guam. I just want to add one note as well, just to some of the things that Laura was saying about procurement in this context too, and about the environmental impact statements that comes with mobile missiles. The United States has traditionally not really engaged much with mobile systems, right? When it comes to weapon systems in particular. This was something that was, experimented with a little bit in the 80s, and there was tremendous local resistance to it, right? There were these local hearings in Utah and Nevada that went terribly for the Pentagon, at least, right? Because there was so much pushback for a variety of reasons, right? Some of these were the environmental factors, because of the mobile aspect is so difficult to control, and what that means for the local infrastructure, but also because mobile systems are incredibly expensive, right? Much more so compared to fixed systems, because you have to support all of these surrounding pieces of infrastructure. And, a lot of these big missiles are not meant to travel on normal roads that cars travel on, right? So you have to deal with all of these different things. And these obviously have significant implications for Guam.
Well, and add to that, so I'm assuming that as a result of conversations like this, we're going to actually get a little bit more transparency on what is intended for these 20 sites. And you add to that also the fact that two items, and there you mentioned recovery bomb shelters, or which I'm assuming exists for inside the military bases, that there's some preparation for that, but they've carefully bifurcated that and said, well, that's a civil defense kind of local homeland security issue, not necessarily a DoD issue. And then you add to that, of course, the the potential of using micronuclear reactors in order to power some of these, to provide power for some of these facilities that are intended. We have a quick question from Nestor. Do we have a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Dr. Underwood. Thank you so much. And hi, Matt and Laura. Very interesting conversation. I guess my question is a little bit of a two-part question. Hearing all of these very alarming and ever escalating missile technology that's being developed, part one of that question is this sort of, and Dr. Underwood alluded to it, Guam as a kind of a guinea pig for the Missile Defense Agency to come up with some kind of missile defense system. Is this more of an exercise in futility? I was wondering if you could comment on that.
I guess I have a brief comment, and it stitches back to the previous comment from Polly. So when we're talking about conventionally armed missiles, I think the strategy is not defend against every single thing. It is often hold it at bay long enough that you can do something else. That's more like the philosophy, or limit the damage, but not no damage. So I think bomb shelters and making sure that you can recover is an appropriate response to that. But if we're talking about nuclear weapons, there is no way to prepare and there is no way to recover.
Yeah.
If that's what we're talking about, that's the answer to that. Then it is very difficult. I would note that China has a no first use policy of nuclear weapons stated, and it is implemented in their force structure. I think there may be ways to ensure, or I would say a really important piece of this is to explore all the ways to make sure that nuclear weapons are not part of the conversation that we're having in any Taiwan scenario. I would say that is worth more than any technological solution that you can come up with, is to try to make sure that that is off the table, and to explore every diplomatic avenue.
And that sort of leads to the second part of my question. I think wouldn't efforts be better served if, similar to, the world governments getting together with this anti-nuclear anti-proliferation, would it be feasible for the world governments to get together and say at this point, because of the technology and the advancement, that it needs to begin talking about anti-offensive missile, if you will, proliferation?
As a way to limit ballistic missile, limit offensive missiles?
Sure. Rather than focusing all of the efforts right now on creating this 360-degree missile defense system for Guam, why not focus your energy and your attention on trying, like we had done with the anti-nuclear proliferation, focus it on anti-offensive missile proliferation?
Well, that's your words to God's ears. May that happen. There have been, of course, examples of that. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, for example, tried to limit the most damaging, the types of things that are have most dangerous characteristics, like short reaction times, for example. So I think I would agree with you. I would say the answer to yours is, of course, yes. That is the best way to provide security, is to make sure that you're not a target.
Yeah.
And that we have less of this. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, because when you talked earlier about, not trying to prevent all missile strikes, but trying to limit it, I would say that one missile strike hitting Guam would be devastation enough. So thank you very much.
All right. We'll go to Joe Taitano real quick. Go ahead. Thank you.
Good day, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for the interesting discussion. If I could ask, when we're thinking about trying to make sense of the media hype and the importance of missiles as we, I think the title of this talk is the new missile age. As if I'm a civilian trying to make sense of this whole situation, what is it that's different about missiles when we're talking about, just folks on the ground who may not necessarily be in the military or part of the defense apparatus? Guam has kind of the distinction of being the one U.S. territory that was occupied during World War II. And if I'm thinking about the possibility of conflict moving forward, is there anything that can be said looking at other places that have had to deal with regular, conventional and ballistic missile attacks? I'm thinking of the Middle East. So what does that mean for the possibility of mass civilian casualties? How is that different from maybe, strategic bombing, something that we've seen on the island before and other places? Is it better or worse, I guess?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, certainly, I feel like in this context, referring back to some of the comments that Laura made earlier, and so some of those examples, right, when it comes to, where these missile defense systems have seen action, right? Because many of those contexts, right, have been in the Middle East, and I guess to some extent we're seeing a little bit of that in Ukraine right now, but a lot of this has been deployed to the Middle East and has seen combat there in some ways and has performed generally not that well, right? So we've seen that. The airport case study that Laura mentioned, the warheads made it through anyways and did cause pretty significant damage, despite the presence of these kinds of missile defense systems being deployed on the ground. So, I feel like we're in territory now where, the Missile Defense Agency is often promising these pretty just incredibly ambitious goals for how they would seek to defend any kind of territory, and we're seeing that individual systems are not able to perform in the ways that they're supposed to perform. So it feels like we're not necessarily moving in the right trend line, and yet the ambitions just keep going up and up and up and up.
I would add to that. So often, I was thinking one of the analogies is Israel, which does have a lot of rockets, but it's facing an adversary that has much less resources, much less technical sophistication. So it's pretty different. So Iron Dome has a very, it's artillery, a lot of homemade artillery rockets, for example. So Ukraine is probably a better example. And so that it'll be interesting to see. Again, it's not the same 360-degree ambition, but it's a pretty hot war, and so it will be interesting to know. It's challenging to think this through, but in a conflict between the United States and China, that would be a real major happening. I mean, something that we do not know how far it's going to go, but it has all sorts of risks of going very large and very destructive. So it's really challenging in my mind thinking about these little pieces of defense when what is likely to happen in a conflict like that is not being restricted to drones and things like that. It would be a real difficult war, which is why I come back to the previous comment that avoiding that at all costs is probably the best use of time and resources in my mind.
Yeah, I'm always curious about the role of the Iron Dome, and as you've indicated, Laura, and I've tried to point out to people that what the kind of adversary that Israel is facing is not certainly not this level of sophistication. So, the idea that you're going to have a and in fact, the term Iron Dome was actually used by some military officers as they moved a THAAD battery around Guam, and then they moved it up to the Northern Marianas. And I thought, well, that's sort of not really on point. We have one more question. Do we have Dana Williams on with the Pacific Island Times? Yes, go ahead, Dana.
Yes, hi. Well, I was wondering with the enhanced system that's being proposed for Guam and these 20 missile sites or 20 defensive sites that we don't really know what's going on each site, but how much real estate would that take? I mean, I'm imagining, you have to have the site itself, right? But then you'd have to have like some kind of security buffer around it, right? For 20 of these sites, like how much land would that, take up? You mentioned we have very limited land here, like 212 square miles. How much would be needed for a system like the one that's being proposed?
I guess it's tough to put your finger on the exact numbers, but certainly one THAAD battery is several different vehicles, right? You need to position your launchers in a certain way. When I look at how they've deployed the THAAD battery in South Korea, they've deployed it onto a golf course, right? And it takes up the whole golf course pretty much, right? Like I think it's, the launchers are on one hole, the command and control stuff is on a few different other holes, and you've got then your security perimeter. So that's just for effectively one system. It's hard to imagine what that would look like, when we think about all of the different moving parts here. But that's just one.
And in addition to that, of course, we'd have to have buffer areas around it. That's the other thing. And then you'd have to, if considering the mobility, you'd have to have a road system that accommodates that. So, there's quite a number of considerations. 20 candidate sites. That's it really sort of contextualizes, I think, the level of intrusion into our day-to-day lives in Guam. Okay, any other question there, Dana? We good?
Well, I guess the other question I have is, I think people wonder if we didn't have this system, what is the alternative? And I know, that Dr. Grego was saying, to look at what's the most imminent threat or what's the biggest threat, but what kind of defense system would be preferable to this one? That's for anybody.
I wish I had an answer for you, Dana. And what I'd like to, before I would answer that, I would want to sit with this a little bit more and understand a little bit more about what the priorities are. I understand the feeling of some defense sounds better than nothing. And I would almost always want to say defense is good. But, when you offer yourself, here's a menu, rather than what can I have a different menu entirely? Here's a menu you can choose from, but are there other menus available? Let's find ways not to make this a problem. I know that sounds pie in the sky and not practical when you're living on the front lines like that. I would say, my concern would not be cost effectiveness, because I think if that was the idea, if the citizens of Guam truly wanted defense, I would say that they should be owed that for hosting these installations, if that's the choice that Guam citizens are making. I think the cost shouldn't be in effect. It should be the use of land and a really thoughtful conversation about what those trade-offs are. And that, I think, really requires a real understanding of, what Matt provided, what are the threats we think are really important, are really realistic, and what are the systems that really might bring us some security, and then have that really informed conversation and trade off against what happens to the land, what happens to our resources, the water. Presumably water is going to be an issue here, power generation, pollution, electromagnetic pollution from radars, all sorts of things that the residents are going to want to consider, I think, in a trade-off. So I would say that the answer to that, the question is the right question. And the answer to that, I think, is a big conversation that should be well informed by these kind of conversations we're having. So I'm sorry that it wasn't a better answer.
Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just a very short thing. Something that, and it's just on this idea of trade-offs, right? So, one thing that the Missile Defense Review suggests is that one of the primary functions of theater missile defense is to enable regional military operations, right? That's one of the reasons why theater missile defense exists, according to the Pentagon, right? And I guess a trade-off here is, if missile defense is, this kind of sort of comes back to the nomenclature, right? Of like missile defense is like the most incredible branding, and not necessarily indicative of what the systems are actually for, because if missile defense is meant to be a defensive system, but it's supporting a posture that could potentially be provocative in some cases, right? Then you do run the risks of wondering, okay, are these defenses, quote unquote defenses, are these defenses worth it? If it enables a posture that could potentially bring the United States and China into direct conflict with one another, in which case, we've already spoken about what would happen, and if that's the case, and no amount of defenses is going to protect anyone from what that war could potentially look like. And so, this all just is, I guess, useful to feed into that broader conversation that I think, Guam, deserves to be having with, in terms of an honest conversation with Pentagon officials and learning a little bit more about what it is that they intend to do here.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this very thoughtful conversation and thoughtful questions, and I appreciate very much your attention. And of course, we're always looking for other solutions than military ones to every problem that we have. So as always, we appreciate it. Thank you for PBS. Thank you for my colleagues in PCIS. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Matt. And thank you for the reporters who asked the questions. Adios.
Thank you.